The more our lives are prolonged and extended, and the more death comes to be seen as an avoidable evil, whose precise moment should be chosen, rather than an inherent feature of human life, the more we will come to be living in a compulsive and narcissistic dread of all risk. Look with horror and distrust on our own children, since the possible consequences of such a risk, the gulf between life and death, will be too vast, too horrible, too fully avoidable to be contemplated. Salvation and life extension will be the same thing. Hence, the price of living a life to the fullest will be deemed too high. The typical man of the medical miracle future will not be a Nietzschean Übermensch, Superman. He will be more like an obsessive compulsive hand washer who lives in constant dread of other people's germs. That such a world would drain human life of its dignity and vigor is not hard to imagine. Just as the treatment of the soul as a mere congeries of manipulable psychological states renders inner life meaningless, so the infinite extension of life will render life infinitely trivial. Death, to quote the poet Wallace Stevens, death is the mother of beauty. Hence from her alone shall come fulfillment to our dreams and our desires. These are words that sound weird, even pathological to the modern secular ear. Let me say them again. Death, this is Wallace Stevens, death is the mother of beauty. Hence from her alone shall come fulfillment to our dreams and our desires. As I say, they sound very strange to our ears. And yet anyone who's read, let's say, a book like the Iliad knows that the gods of that Homeric epic are much less admirable, less noble, less beautiful than the human warriors, precisely because these gods cannot die, cannot suffer, and therefore cannot live lives of consequence. All they can do is meddle in the lives of mortals who have to play the game of life for keeps. The real beauty of human character is something different from mastery. It's something like the beauty of weathered wood, a beauty grained and deepened by its graceful and dignified incorporation of the elements within which it exists. Our dignity exists not only in our drive for mastery, and that surely is part of it, but also in the acceptance of limits on our will. How we come to terms with our defeats, our failures, our decay, and our yielded territory, and nevertheless trudge ahead to a destination we could never have known or chosen at the outset because we could never have imagined it. All right, so you're thinking, what does this have to do with public policy? You were thinking that, weren't you? Well, that's simple. This discussion underscores the fact that public policy is always an effort to address itself to the human condition, to the kinds of creatures that we are and aspire to become, to the hopes and expectations that we bring to the pursuit of happiness. This is why the proper study of public policy, which is, after all, what you do here at Pepperdine, proper study of public policy, the proper study involves acknowledging the importance of ideas in history. What do ideas have to do with the pursuit of happiness? Everything. Because life is a game of expectations. And the pattern of expectations to which the pursuit of happiness conforms itself at any given time is itself a product of the dominant ideas of the time. Ideas about life, death, God, nature, causality, moral responsibility, and human possibility. In a word, what we believe about the world's structure and meaning determines what we think happiness is and how we can act to gain it for ourselves. Even more simply, what we believe provides the basic structure of what we expect or think we can expect. If we had lived in a time like that of Homer's Greeks and Trojans, a time when the forces of nature are dimly understood and basically seen as the uncontrollable playthings of Zeus and Poseidon or fate, even more inscrutable. If we lived in such a world, happiness would be an elusive and chancy thing. But in an era of growing mastery, when these forces are ever more completely under our control, expectations change. And happiness becomes something that all human beings can rightly aspire to in the here and now as a natural expression of their natural human endowment. There is no more characteristically modern, and I might say more American, assumption than the belief that it lies within our power to find happiness. Within our power. So what happens when the forces of nature suddenly surge out of control? Well, one thing that happens is we find out that our modern habits die hard. We expect mastery at every turn, and we fly into a rage when we don't get it. Consider the example of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. As the events associated with that tragic event were unfolding, one would have thought that the fury and carnage of the hurricane and the widespread suffering in its aftermath, rather than representing what used to be called an act of God, could be blamed entirely on the crimes of commission and omission perpetrated by the current political leaders, from the mayor of New Orleans to the governor of Louisiana to President George W. Bush. It is striking how quickly the blame game and the manipulation of angry emotion became a conspicuous part of the many dozens of television images hauntingly depicting the violence and squalor and vulnerability into which so many New Orleanians were plunged by these catastrophic events. Let me give an example. This is a portion of an interview with Senator Mary Landrieu of Louisiana, conducted by Anderson Cooper of the cable news network. Landrieu had just finished praising the relief efforts of some of her fellow Louisiana politicians when she was rudely interrupted by Cooper. Cooper, Senator, I'm sorry, but for the last 4 days I've been seeing dead bodies here in the street. And to listen to politicians thanking each other and complimenting each other, I have to tell you, there are people here who are very upset and angry, and when they hear politicians thanking one another, it just, it cuts them the wrong way, because there was a body on the streets of this town yesterday being eaten by rats, because this woman had been laying in the street for 48 hours, and there's not enough facilities to get her up. Do you understand that anger? Landrieu, I have that anger inside of me. Most of the homes in my family have been destroyed. I understand that, and I know all the details, and the president, Cooper, interrupts. Well, who are you angry at? That, I think, is a fascinating question. I wondered, at the time, just what was stopping Mr. Cooper from bringing the poor woman's body in off the streets himself. But instead, surrounded by devastation and suffering, the star reporter used her body as a prop and homed in on what was, to him, the most urgent consideration of all. Who are you angry at? And that indeed was the question of the hour. Hardly had the rain stopped falling on the unlucky Gulf Coast than the search was on for certifiable villains. The game was in motion, and the very stones and waters cried out for vengeance. In the campaign to score political points, an impressive litany of charges was assembled in record time. But as a handful of sober observers knew at the time, the true villains, if one had to have villains, were no longer on the scene. The most crucial errors were made many decades before, in the inadequate construction of the levees and navigational channels, in the imprudent patterns of development in vulnerable areas, encouraged by well-intentioned federal policies. All of these, and some other factors, added up to a catastrophe many years in the making. But such a complex explanation did not supply a satisfying answer to the crude question, who are you angry at?